The wagon lurched to a stop outside the small wooden church in Deadwood, South Dakota, and Caleb Montgomery saw her through the dust-streaked window, a bride in a yellowed lace dress with a purple bruise blooming across her left eye like a twisted violet. It was June 1876, and Caleb had come down from his cabin in the Black Hills only because his sister Martha had begged him to attend her friend's wedding. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown elk down a mountain, arms thick with muscle from years of chopping wood and hauling traps through snow. His dark hair fell past his collar, and his beard was neatly trimmed despite living alone for the past 3 years. At 28, he had grown comfortable with solitude, preferring the company of pine trees and clear streams to the chaos of town life. But that bruise changed everything. The bride stumbled as she climbed down from the wagon, and Caleb saw her wince. Her hair was a rich auburn color, pinned up elaborately beneath a thin veil, and even from across the street he could see her hands trembling as she smoothed down her dress. A man climbed down after her, tall, well-dressed in an expensive suit, with slicked-back blonde hair and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "That is Eleanor Whitmore," Martha whispered beside Caleb, following his gaze. "She is marrying Richard Carver today. He owns the new mercantile and half the mining claims south of here." "He gave her that black eye," Caleb said flatly. Martha's face tightened. "I know. I tried to talk to her yesterday, but she said she fell. Caleb, please do not cause a scene. Richard Carver has powerful friends, and Eleanor seems determined to go through with this." Caleb watched as Richard gripped Eleanor's elbow, his fingers pressing into her flesh hard enough that even at a distance, Caleb could see her stiffen. The groom leaned close and whispered something that made Eleanor's already pale face turn ashen. Every instinct in Caleb's body screamed at him to intervene, but Martha was right. This was not his business. He did not know this woman. She was making her own choices, however misguided. He had no right to interfere in another man's wedding, no matter what his gut told him. The church bells began to ring, and people filed inside. Caleb sat rigid in the back pew, Martha on one side, and her husband Thomas on the other. The church filled with townspeople, most dressed in their Sunday best despite the Saturday ceremony. Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm, a gray-haired man who looked defeated, his eyes fixed straight ahead as though he could not bear to look at his daughter. The preacher began the ceremony. Eleanor's voice shook as she recited her vows, barely audible even in the quiet church. When Richard spoke, his voice rang out confident and possessive. He slipped a gold ring on her finger with a flourish, and Caleb saw Eleanor flinch again. "If anyone objects to this union, speak now or forever hold your peace," the preacher intoned. The silence stretched. Caleb's hands gripped the pew in front of him, his knuckles white. Every fiber of his being wanted to stand up, to shout, to stop this travesty. But he remained seated. It was not his place. He was a mountain man who trapped and hunted, who lived alone and preferred it that way. What could he possibly offer this refined town woman anyway? "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Richard grabbed Eleanor and kissed her roughly, and Caleb saw her hands push weakly against his chest before falling limp at her sides. The congregation applauded. Rice was thrown. The newlyweds climbed into a decorated carriage to head to the hotel for the reception. Caleb stood outside the church, watching the carriage disappear down the main street. Something felt profoundly wrong, like watching a trap snap shut on an animal that did not deserve to suffer. "Are you coming to the reception?" Martha asked. "No," Caleb said. "I'm heading back to the mountain." His sister looked relieved. "Probably for the best. I will bring you supplies next week." Caleb collected his horse from the livery, a sturdy roan mare named Red, and began the ride back toward his cabin. The town fell away behind him, replaced by ponderosa pines and rocky outcroppings. The air grew cleaner, colder. This was where he belonged, away from the complications of civilization. But he could not stop seeing that bruise, that trembling. The way Eleanor had looked like a deer caught in a hunter's sight. 2 miles outside town, Caleb pulled Red to a stop. He sat there for a long moment, jaw clenched, staring at the trail ahead that would take him home. Then, he turned the horse around and rode back toward Deadwood at a gallop. He had never been good at minding his own business when someone needed help. The hotel where the reception was being held sat on the corner of Main Street and Gold Avenue, a two-story structure that was fancier than most buildings in Deadwood. Caleb could hear music and laughter coming from the second floor as he tied Red to the hitching post. He was aware that he looked out of place in his buckskin pants and simple cotton shirt, with his knife strapped to his belt and trail dust covering his boots. But he did not care. Inside, he climbed the stairs and found the reception hall packed with guests. A fiddle player and guitarist provided music, while people danced and ate from a long table laden with food. Caleb scanned the crowd and found Eleanor sitting alone at the head table, her new husband nowhere in sight. He moved through the crowd, ignoring the curious stares. Up close, Eleanor was younger than he had initially thought, perhaps 22 or 23, with delicate features and intelligent green eyes that held a deep sadness. The bruise on her face was even more vivid in the lamplight. "Mrs. Carver," Caleb said, keeping his voice low, "my name is Caleb Montgomery. I need to speak with you." Eleanor looked up, startled. "I do not believe we have met, Mr. Montgomery." "We have not, but I saw you arrive at the church today, and I saw what your husband did to you." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "If you need help, if you want to leave, I can get you out of here right now." Eleanor's eyes widened, and for a moment, hope flickered across her face. Then fear replaced it, and she glanced around nervously. "You should not be saying such things. Richard is my husband now. It would be a sin to leave him." "It is a sin what he is doing to you," Caleb countered. He crouched down beside her chair so they were eye level. "I have a cabin in the Black Hills, isolated and safe. You could stay there until we figure out what to do, where you could go. You do not have to live like this." "You do not understand," Eleanor whispered, and tears filled her eyes. "My father lost everything in a bad mining investment. Richard paid off all his debts in exchange for my hand. If I leave, Richard will ruin my family completely. He has threatened to have my father arrested for fraud, to make sure my younger sister never finds a decent husband in this territory. I have no choice." "There is always a choice," Caleb said firmly. "What is going on here?" The voice was cold and sharp. Caleb stood and turned to find Richard Carver approaching, two large men flanking him. Up close, the groom was handsome in a polished way, but his pale blue eyes were hard as flint. "I was just congratulating the bride," Caleb said evenly. "I do not know you," Richard said, looking Caleb up and down with barely concealed contempt. "You are clearly not part of our social circle. I suggest you leave before I have you thrown out." Caleb held his ground. "I was just leaving. But first I wanted to ask how Mrs. Carver got that black eye." The room had gone quiet. People were turning to watch. Richard's face flushed red. "My wife is clumsy. She walked into a door. Not that it is any of your concern, you filthy mountain savage." "Funny," Caleb said, his voice deadly calm, "because from where I stand, it looks exactly like the mark a man's fist would make." Richard moved fast, pulling back his arm to throw a punch, but Caleb was faster. He caught Richard's wrist in mid-swing, his grip like iron. The two men flanking Richard started forward, but Caleb twisted Richard's arm enough to make him gasp. "I do not want trouble," Caleb said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But I will not stand by and watch a man hurt a woman. Mrs. Carver, the offer stands. If you want to leave, I will take you somewhere safe." "She's not going anywhere," Richard snarled, trying to wrench his arm free. "She is my wife, my property." "She's a human being," Caleb said. He released Richard and stepped back, his eyes finding Eleanor's. She was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. "The decision is yours, ma'am." For a long moment, Eleanor stared at him. He could see the war raging behind her eyes, fear and hope and desperation all tangled together. Then she looked at Richard, at his furious red face and clenched fists, and something seemed to break inside her. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, I want to leave." The room erupted. Richard lunged forward, but Caleb was already moving, putting himself between the groom and bride. "You touch her again, and I will break every bone in your hand," Caleb said quietly. "You cannot do this," Richard shouted. "She is my wife. We were just married." "And now she's leaving you," Caleb said. He held out his hand to Eleanor. "Come with me, quickly." Eleanor stood on shaking legs. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Let her go," and then others joined in. Not everyone, but enough voices that Richard's two hired men hesitated. Caleb wrapped his hand around Eleanor's, feeling how small and cold her fingers were, and guided her toward the door. They made it to the stairs before Richard found his voice again. "You will regret this, both of you. I will have you arrested for kidnapping. I will hunt you down." Caleb did not respond. He focused on getting Eleanor down the stairs and outside to where Red waited. He lifted Eleanor onto the horse with ease despite her voluminous dress, then swung up behind her. She was trembling violently now, whether from fear or relief or shock, he could not tell. "Hold on tight," he said, and kicked Red into motion. They galloped out of Deadwood as shouts rose behind them. Caleb took a winding route through the hills, using every tracker's trick he knew to obscure their trail. Eleanor clung to the saddle horn, her wedding dress billowing around them both. Only when they were miles from town, deep in the pine forest as twilight settled over the mountains, did Caleb slow Red to a walk. "Are you all right?" he asked. Eleanor did not answer immediately. Then she started to laugh, a high, slightly hysterical sound. "I just left my husband on my wedding day. I do not know if I will ever be all right again." "You will," Caleb said with certainty. "It might take time, but you will." "Why did you come back?" Eleanor asked, turning slightly to look at him. "You left after the ceremony. I saw you. What made you return?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, guiding Red around a fallen log. "I could not live with myself if I did not try to help. I have seen trapped animals in the wilderness, and that is what you looked like, trapped. I had to at least offer you a way out. You do not even know me," Eleanor said softly. "I know enough," Caleb replied. "I know you did not deserve what he did to you. I know you were brave enough to say yes when I offered you an escape. That tells me all I need to know." They rode in silence for a while longer. Full darkness had fallen by the time Caleb's cabin came into view, a solid log structure with a stone chimney nestled against the mountainside with a small barn nearby. Smoke rose from the chimney. Caleb had banked the fire that morning before leaving. He helped Eleanor down from the horse, noticing how exhausted she looked. The adrenaline that had carried her through the escape was clearly wearing off. While he tended to Red, Eleanor stood uncertainly by the cabin door, still in her wedding dress, looking utterly out of place against the rough-hewn logs. "Come inside," Caleb said, finishing with the horse. "You must be hungry." The cabin's interior was simple but comfortable. One large room served as kitchen, living area, and dining space, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A ladder led to a sleeping loft above. Furs covered the plank floor, and shelves lined the walls, holding supplies, books, and various tools of Caleb's trade. "You can take the loft," Caleb said, stirring up the fire. "I will sleep down here. Are you hungry? I have venison stew I can heat up." Eleanor nodded mutely. She was shivering again despite the warmth of the fire. Caleb realized she was probably in shock, the reality of what she had done finally settling in. He heated the stew and poured her a cup of coffee, both of which she accepted gratefully. They sat at his small wooden table, and Eleanor ate mechanically, staring into the fire. "What happens now?" she finally asked. "Now you rest," Caleb said. "Tomorrow we will figure out the next steps. We need to consider what Richard might do, whether he will try to find you. We need to think about where you might want to go, what you want to do with your life now that you are free." "Free," Eleanor repeated, as if testing the word. "I do not think I have ever truly been free. My father controlled every aspect of my life until he sold me to Richard." Her voice was bitter. "Your father sold you?" Caleb asked carefully. Eleanor set down her spoon. "Perhaps that is unfair. He did not intend it that way. But yes, essentially, he promised me to Richard in exchange for Richard paying off his debts. I had no say in the matter. Richard courted me for 3 weeks, and during that time he was charming and attentive. It was only after the engagement was announced that he started showing his true nature. He would grab my arm too hard if I disagreed with him. He would say cruel things about my appearance or intelligence. 2 days ago, I told him I wanted to postpone the wedding, and he hit me." She touched her bruised eye gingerly. "He apologized afterward, said it would never happen again, but I knew it would. I knew I was marrying a monster, but I could not see any way out." "And now you are out," Caleb said gently. "And now I am out," Eleanor echoed. She looked at him across the table. "I do not understand why you did this. You risked everything for a stranger. Richard will come after you. He has money and influence. He could make your life very difficult." Caleb shrugged. I live on a mountain. There's not much he can do to me here. And as for why? He paused, searching for words. My mother was married to a man who hurt her, my real father. I was too young to help her, but I remember how she would cry at night, how she would make excuses for bruises. She finally left him when I was 7, and we came west. She met Thomas's father, a good man who treated her right, and she had 10 happy years with him before she passed. But I never forgot those early years. I swore that if I ever had the chance to help a woman in that situation, I would. So when I saw you today, I could not just walk away. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears again. I'm sorry you went through that, and I am grateful you remembered. You saved my life today, Mr. Montgomery. I truly believe that. Caleb, he corrected. And you saved yourself by having the courage to say yes. They talked for a while longer, the conversation gradually becoming easier. Caleb learned that Eleanor had been educated at a finishing school in St. Louis, that she loved reading and had always dreamed of becoming a teacher, that her mother had died when she was 16, and she had been essentially running her father's household ever since. She had a quick mind and a dry sense of humor that emerged as she relaxed. For his part, Caleb told her about his life on the mountain, about trapping and hunting and the rhythm of the seasons. He told her about the wildlife he encountered, the harsh winters and beautiful summers, the satisfaction of living by his own hands. It sounds lonely, Eleanor observed. It is, Caleb admitted, but it is also peaceful. After my mother died, I found I preferred the company of nature to people. People are complicated and often cruel. Animals are honest. The wilderness is honest. You know what to expect. And now you have brought a very complicated person into your peaceful wilderness, Eleanor said with a small smile. Caleb smiled back. I suppose I have, but I do not regret it. As the night grew late, Caleb showed Eleanor to the loft, giving her one of his nightshirts to wear since she certainly could not sleep in her wedding dress. He politely turned away while she changed, then said good night, and retreated to the main room where he laid out his bedroll near the fire. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of Eleanor settling in above him, wondering what the coming days would bring. He had acted on instinct, but now he had to face the practical realities. Richard Carver would indeed come looking for his runaway bride. The law might technically be on Richard's side, though there were no real lawmen this far into the Black Hills. Caleb's cabin was remote, hard to find if you did not know the way, but Richard had money to hire trackers. And then there was the woman herself. Eleanor was educated, refined, used to a very different life than what Caleb could offer. She would probably want to leave the territory entirely, go somewhere Richard could not find her. Caleb would help her do that, of course. It was the right thing to do. He tried not to think about how beautiful she had looked in the firelight, or how her smile had made something in his chest tighten. She was vulnerable, frightened, escaping from an abusive situation. The last thing she needed was another man complicating her life. Caleb would help her get safe and get free, and then he would return to his mountain and his solitude. It was the right thing to do, the only thing to do, even if some newly awakened part of him already dreaded the day she would leave. Morning came cold and clear. Caleb woke to find Eleanor already up, standing at the window looking out at the view. She had put her wedding dress back on, having nothing else to wear, but she had removed most of the elaborate hairpins, so her auburn hair fell in loose waves down her back. Good morning, Caleb said, stirring up the fire. How did you sleep? Better than I expected, Eleanor admitted. I thought I would lie awake all night worrying, but I actually felt safe enough to rest. That is something I have not felt in weeks. Caleb made breakfast, flapjacks with wild berry syrup and bacon, and they ate while discussing practical matters. Eleanor needed clothes more suitable for mountain life. She needed to send word to her father and sister that she was safe, though that would have to be done carefully to avoid tipping off Richard. Most importantly, they needed to decide on a long-term plan. I have some money, Eleanor said. Not much, but my grandmother left me a small inheritance that my father could not touch. It is in a bank in Cheyenne. If I could get there, I could access it and perhaps travel further, maybe to California or Oregon, somewhere I could start over. Cheyenne is a week's ride, Caleb said thoughtfully. We would have to be careful. Richard will likely send people looking for you on all the main routes. We, Eleanor repeated, looking at him. I am not sending you off alone, Caleb said firmly. Richard is dangerous, and you do not know these territories. I will take you to Cheyenne, make sure you get your money, and see you safely on your way to wherever you decide to go. That's a lot to ask, Eleanor said quietly. You have already done so much. I am offering, Caleb said. Besides, I have a friend in Cheyenne I have been meaning to visit, a fellow trapper named James Cooper. We served together in the army before I came up to the Black Hills. That was not entirely true. Caleb had been planning no such visit, but he could see Eleanor needed to feel like she was not imposing. The truth was, he wanted to make sure she was truly safe before he let her out of his sight. Richard Carver did not strike him as the type of man to give up easily. They spent the day preparing for the journey. Caleb had some extra clothes from before he had fully grown into his current size, and while they were too large for Eleanor, she was able to make them work with some adjustments. She swapped her fancy dress for canvas pants, a cotton shirt, and a leather vest. With her hair braided back and a wide-brimmed hat on her head, she looked like a different person, more relaxed, younger, almost happy. I have never worn pants before, she said, laughing as she examined herself. This is scandalous. This is practical, Caleb countered. You cannot ride a week through the wilderness in a dress. That afternoon, he taught her how to shoot his spare rifle, setting up targets in the clearing behind the cabin. Eleanor had never held a gun before, but she proved to be a quick study, listening carefully to his instructions and improving with each shot. You have a steady hand, Caleb observed, impressed. Most people flinch when they pull the trigger, but you keep your arm firm. I used to do needlepoint, Eleanor said. My teacher always praised my steady hand. I never imagined that skill would transfer to shooting. A steady hand is a steady hand, Caleb said with a smile, and knowing how to shoot might save your life out here. As the sun began to set, they returned to the cabin. Eleanor insisted on cooking dinner, despite Caleb's protests that she was his guest. She made a surprisingly good rabbit stew with the supplies she found in his pantry, seasoning it with wild herbs. My mother taught me to cook, Eleanor explained as they ate. She said a woman should know how to run a household efficiently, whether she had servants or not. I actually enjoy it. It is satisfying to create something with your own hands. I know what you mean, Caleb said. There is something deeply satisfying about providing for yourself, being self-sufficient. Every meal I eat, I either hunted, trapped, grew, or traded for. Nothing is taken for granted. They talked long into the evening again, and Caleb found himself enjoying the conversation more than he had enjoyed anything in years. Eleanor was intelligent and curious, asking him questions about his life that no one had ever bothered to ask before. She wanted to know about his time in the army, about learning to trap and hunt, about building his cabin with his own hands. In turn, Caleb asked about her childhood in St. Louis, her years at finishing school, what it was like to grow up in a city. Eleanor described a world completely foreign to him, ballrooms and social calls, elaborate dinners and strict rules about propriety. It sounds suffocating, Caleb observed. It was, Eleanor agreed. I always felt like I was playing a role, wearing a mask. Even before Richard, I felt trapped by expectations. I was supposed to marry well, run a household, produce heirs, and never have an original thought. The idea of becoming a teacher was considered radical. My father forbade me from even considering it. Why a teacher? Caleb asked. Eleanor's face lit up. Because I love learning, and I love the idea of helping others learn. When I was at finishing school, we would sometimes volunteer at a small school for poor children. Those were the happiest hours of my week, working with those children, seeing their faces light up when they finally understood something. I felt like I was actually doing something meaningful, not just practicing needlepoint or learning which fork to use at dinner. You could still do that, Caleb said. Once you are settled somewhere new, you could find a school that needs a teacher. Maybe, Eleanor said, but she sounded doubtful. I do not know what kind of references I could provide now, and I would have to explain why I left my husband on my wedding day. That's not exactly the kind of respectability schools look for in their teachers. Then you lie, Caleb said bluntly. You say your husband died tragically, or you were never married at all. You're starting over. Eleanor, you can write whatever story you want for your life. Eleanor looked at him with something like wonder. You make it sound so simple. It is not simple, Caleb acknowledged, but it is possible. You are braver than you give yourself credit for. You walked away from everything you knew yesterday. That takes incredible courage." "I was terrified," Eleanor admitted. "I still am. But when you offered me that choice, I realized I would rather face unknown fear than certain pain. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Caleb said. On the third day after Eleanor's escape, Caleb's sister Martha arrived at the cabin. She came riding hard up the mountain trail, her face flushed with urgency. "Caleb," she called out as she dismounted, "thank God I found you." Caleb had been chopping wood while Eleanor tended the small vegetable garden behind the cabin. They both hurried over to Martha, who looked between them with relief. "You both need to know. Richard Carver is offering a reward for information leading to Eleanor's return. $200. He has men searching all through Deadwood and the surrounding camps. He's telling everyone Eleanor was kidnapped, that you forced her to leave against her will." "That's a lie," Eleanor said hotly. "I chose to leave." "I know that, and most of the women in town know that too," Martha said. "We saw your bruise, Eleanor. We heard the rumors about Richard's temper. But he has money and influence, and $200 is a fortune to most miners. You are not safe here, either of you." "We are leaving for Cheyenne tomorrow," Caleb said. "We just needed a few days to prepare." Martha nodded approvingly. "Good, but be careful on the trail. Richard has hired some rough men, bounty hunters and worse. They will not be gentle if they find you." She turned to Eleanor. "Your father has been sick with worry. He came to see me, asked me to pass along that he is sorry, that if he had known what Richard was truly like, he never would have agreed to the match." Eleanor's face softened. "Is he all right? Richard has not hurt him?" "Not yet, but Richard is threatening to ruin him. Your father wants you to run, to get as far away as possible. He says he will handle Richard." "My father cannot handle Richard," Eleanor said bitterly. "Richard owns him." "Maybe," Martha said, "but your father loves you. He is willing to face the consequences if it means you are free and safe." She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a bundle. "I brought you some proper traveling clothes, Eleanor, and some supplies for the journey, food, ammunition, a better bedroll." "Thank you," Eleanor said, hugging Martha. "Thank you for everything." Martha hugged her back, then turned to Caleb. "Keep her safe, brother, and keep yourself safe too. I do not trust Richard Carver. He is the kind of man who will burn down the world if he does not get what he wants." After Martha left, Caleb and Eleanor spent the rest of the day preparing in earnest for their departure. The sense of urgency was palpable now. Caleb packed his saddlebags with care, making sure they had enough supplies for the journey, but not so much that it would slow them down. He cleaned and loaded both rifles, sharpened his hunting knife, and checked Red's shoes. Eleanor proved herself capable and level-headed, following Caleb's instructions without complaint. She rolled the bedrolls tight, organized the food supplies efficiently, and helped him map out their route. "We will avoid the main trails," Caleb explained, tracing their path on his rough map. "It will take longer, but it is safer. We will travel through the high country, camp cold when we have to. No fires that might give away our position. It will be hard, Eleanor. Harder than anything you have probably done before." "I can handle it," Eleanor said firmly. "I'm stronger than I look." Caleb believed her. Over the past few days, he had watched her adapt to mountain life with surprising ease. She did not complain about the rustic conditions or the hard work. She faced each challenge with determination. He found himself admiring her more with each passing hour. That evening, as they shared what might be their last meal in the cabin for a long while, Eleanor asked, "What will you do after you take me to Cheyenne? Will you come back here?" Caleb considered the question. "I suppose so. This is my home." "Will you miss it? Being away for a few weeks?" "Maybe," Caleb admitted, "but it will still be here when I get back. The mountain is not going anywhere." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I will miss it. I know that probably sounds strange since I have only been here a few days, but this cabin feels more like a home than anywhere I have lived in years. It is peaceful, safe. I could understand why someone would choose this life." Something in her voice made Caleb's heart beat faster, but he kept his tone casual. "The winters are brutal. You would not be saying that in January when the snow is 6 feet deep and you have not seen another human in 2 months. "Maybe not," Eleanor agreed with a small smile. "But right now, in this moment, I cannot imagine anywhere I would rather be." Their eyes met across the table, and something electric passed between them. Caleb was intensely aware of her presence, the way the firelight caught in her hair, the intelligence in her green eyes, the strength in her bearing. He wanted to reach across the table and take her hand, wanted to tell her she could stay as long as she wanted to kiss her. Instead, he stood abruptly. "We should get some rest. We leave at dawn." If Eleanor was disappointed by his retreat, she did not show it. "You are right. Good night, Caleb." "Good night, Eleanor." Caleb lay awake long after the fire had burned down to embers, listening to Eleanor breathing softly in the loft above. He was playing a dangerous game with his own heart. Eleanor was vulnerable, and he was her protector. She depended on him. Any feelings she might have toward him were likely just gratitude, and the natural result of him being the only person in her life right now who had shown her kindness. Once she was free and safe in Cheyenne, once she had time to heal and think clearly, she would realize she did not really want a life with a rough mountain man. She would want to go to California or Oregon, would want to use her education and start over somewhere civilized. And that was right. That was what she deserved. Caleb just had to keep reminding himself of that fact, even as every instinct in his body screamed at him to ask her to stay. They left at first light, with the cabin locked up behind them, and Red carrying both of them plus their supplies. Caleb set a steady pace, heading south and east through terrain he knew well. They stayed off the main trails, following deer paths and dry creek beds, using every trick Caleb knew to hide their passage. Eleanor rode in front of him, and Caleb tried not to think about how good it felt to have his arms around her as he held the reins. She fit against him perfectly, her back pressed to his chest, her hair occasionally brushing his face when the wind picked up. She smelled like wood smoke and pine and something floral that must have been her soap. They traveled in companionable silence for the most part, saving their breath for the hard climb through the high country. When they did talk, it was about practical things: where to camp, what route to take, whether they should risk hunting or rely on the jerky and hardtack Martha had provided. On the second day, they saw riders in the valley below, 3 men on horseback, clearly searching for something or someone. Caleb quickly guided Red into a thick stand of pine trees and dismounted, motioning for Eleanor to stay quiet. They watched as the riders circled below, moving methodically through the area. "Richard's men?" Eleanor whispered. "Likely," Caleb confirmed. "They are searching, but they do not know these mountains like I do. We will wait here until they move on." They waited for over an hour, standing close together behind the trees with Red hidden further back. Caleb could feel the tension in Eleanor's body, the fear she was trying hard to control. Without thinking, he put his hand on her shoulder, a gesture meant to comfort. Eleanor covered his hand with her own, holding it there. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." "We are not out of this yet," Caleb cautioned. "I know. But even if Richard's men find us, even if this all goes wrong, I want you to know that these past few days have been the freest I've ever felt. You gave me that, Caleb. You gave me hope that life could be different." Caleb squeezed her shoulder gently, not trusting himself to speak. The riders below finally moved on, and they were able to continue their journey, but Eleanor's words echoed in Caleb's mind for the rest of the day. That night, they made camp in a small cave Caleb knew, built into the side of a rocky outcropping. It was defensible and hidden, and he deemed it safe enough for a small fire to cook their meal and ward off the nighttime chill. They ate beans and cornbread, washing it down with water from a nearby stream. "Can I ask you something personal?" Eleanor said as they sat by the fire. "Of course." "Have you ever been in love?" The question caught Caleb off guard. "Once," he admitted after a moment, "when I was 20. Her name was Sarah. She was the daughter of a shopkeeper in Rapid City. We courted for 6 months and I thought we might marry. But when I told her I wanted to live in the mountains, wanted to trap and hunt rather than work in town, she said she could never live that way. She married a bank clerk instead." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said softly. Caleb shrugged. "It was for the best. Sarah wanted a certain kind of life, and I wanted a different one. Neither of us was wrong, but we were not right for each other. After that, I decided it was easier to live alone. No complications, no compromises, no heartbreak. Does it work, living alone?" "Most of the time," Caleb said honestly, "but sometimes it is lonely. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to have someone to share things with, The sunset over the mountains, the first snow of winter, the sound of the creek in spring. But those are just moments. The reality is that I am not easy to live with. I am set in my ways, rough around the edges. Most women would not want the life I lead. Most women, Eleanor repeated thoughtfully. But maybe not all women? Caleb looked at her, seeing the question in her eyes. Eleanor, you have been through a trauma. You are running for your life. This is not the time to be making decisions about the future. I am not making decisions, Eleanor said. I'm just asking questions. She moved a little closer to him, and Caleb's breath caught. You keep trying to push me away, to remind me that I do not really want this, that I am just confused. But Caleb, I am not confused. I know my own mind, and I know that I feel safer and more myself with you than I have ever felt with anyone. Eleanor, Caleb started, but she pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him. I'm not asking you for forever. I'm not asking you for promises. I'm just telling you how I feel right now, in this moment. Is that all right? Caleb closed his eyes, fighting against every instinct that told him to pull her into his arms and never let go. You're making this very difficult, he said roughly. Good, Eleanor said, and there was a hint of mischief in her voice that made Caleb smile despite himself. We should get some sleep, he said, opening his eyes. Long day tomorrow. Eleanor nodded and moved to her bedroll, but the air between them had changed. There was an acknowledgement now, an understanding of what was growing between them, even if neither of them was ready to fully act on it yet. The next 3 days of travel were hard but uneventful. They made good progress, crossing into Wyoming territory and leaving the Black Hills behind. The landscape changed from pine forests to rolling grasslands, and the weather grew warmer. They saw no more signs of Richard's men, and Eleanor began to relax, to believe they might actually make it to Cheyenne safely. Caleb watched her transform as they traveled. Each day she seemed more confident, more comfortable in her own skin. She learned to ride astride like a man instead of side saddle, learned to read the land and the weather, learned to move quietly through the wilderness. She was a natural, and Caleb found himself thinking more and more about what Martha had said years ago, that someday he might find someone who fit into his life perfectly. Was Eleanor that person? Could a refined city woman really be happy living in a mountain cabin? More importantly, even if she could, did he have the right to ask that of her? She deserved the chance to see the world, to explore her options, to become the teacher she had always dreamed of being. On the 6th night, they camped beside a wide river, and Caleb caught fish for their dinner. Eleanor gathered wild onions and greens to go with it, and they cooked together in easy companionship. After they ate, they sat by the fire, watching the stars come out. My mother used to tell me stories about the constellations, Eleanor said, gazing up at the sky. She knew all the Greek myths. That is Cassiopeia, and there is Orion the hunter. She said the stars were proof that there was order in the universe, that everything had its place and purpose. What do you think? Caleb asked. I think the stars are beautiful, and I do not need them to mean anything more than that, Eleanor said. But I like the idea that we are all connected, all part of something larger than ourselves. We are, Caleb said. Every living thing is connected. The trees breathe out what we breathe in. The deer eat the grass, we eat the deer, and when we die, we feed the grass. It is a circle, a web. Everything touches everything else. Eleanor looked at him with those intelligent green eyes. You are a philosopher, Caleb Montgomery. I'm a trapper, Caleb corrected with a smile, but spending time alone gives you time to think. Will you miss it, being alone after this is over? Probably, Caleb admitted. But I will also miss having someone to talk to. It is a strange contradiction. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very softly, You do not have to miss either one. You could have both. Eleanor, I know, I am not thinking clearly. I am just grateful. I do not really know what I want, Eleanor said, a note of frustration in her voice. But Caleb, answer me this. Do you feel anything for me? Anything at all beyond obligation and pity? Caleb's jaw clenched. He could lie, could tell her no, could maintain the careful distance he had been trying to keep. But he had never been good at lying. Yes, he said hoarsely. Yes, I feel something. I have felt it since I saw you standing outside that church. But Eleanor, that does not change anything. You still deserve the chance to build whatever life you want, free from any man's expectations, including mine. Eleanor moved then, shifting closer until she was kneeling right in front of him. And what if the life I want includes you? You do not know that yet, Caleb said desperately. You cannot know that. You have been out of Richard's control for less than a week. You need time, space, freedom to figure out who you are and what you want. I know who I am, Eleanor said firmly. Maybe for the first time in my life, I actually know. I'm strong. I'm capable. I'm braver than I thought. And I know what I feel when I look at you, Caleb. I know how my heart beats faster when you smile at me. I know how safe I feel in your arms. I know that when I imagine the future, I see your cabin in the mountains, your fire, your life. Maybe that is foolish. Maybe it is too soon. But it is how I feel. Caleb reached out and cupped her face gently, his thumb tracing over her cheekbone. The bruise had faded to a yellowish green, almost gone now. You are the most remarkable woman I have ever met, he said quietly, and I would be lying if I said I did not want you to stay. But I need you to be sure, Eleanor. I need you to have the chance to choose freely, without pressure or circumstances forcing your hand. Then let me choose, Eleanor whispered. She leaned forward and kissed him. For a moment, Caleb froze. Then he was kissing her back, one hand sliding into her hair while the other pulled her closer. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but it quickly deepened. Eleanor made a soft sound and pressed against him, and Caleb felt years of loneliness and longing pour into that kiss. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. We should still go to Cheyenne, he said. You should still get your money, still have options. But Eleanor, if after all that you still want to come back to the Black Hills with me, I would be honored to have you. I will still want to, Eleanor said with certainty. I already know, Caleb, but I will do it your way. We will go to Cheyenne. I will get my inheritance, and then I will come home with you. They kissed again, longer this time, and when they finally settled down to sleep, Eleanor curled up against Caleb's chest, his arms wrapped protectively around her. For the first time since his mother died, Caleb felt complete. They reached Cheyenne on the afternoon of the 8th day. The town was much larger than Deadwood, more established, with actual streets and a railroad depot. Caleb felt out of place immediately, but Eleanor seemed to relax slightly, seeing civilization again. They found a respectable boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson, who asked no questions when Caleb introduced Eleanor as his wife. They took a single room, both knowing it would be safer to stay together and both wanting to be close after the intimacy they had shared over the past few nights. The next morning, Eleanor went to the bank to access her inheritance while Caleb visited his old Army friend, James Cooper. James worked as a hunting guide now, taking wealthy Eastern tourists out into the wilderness for adventure. Caleb Montgomery, James exclaimed, shaking his hand vigorously. I thought you had turned into a hermit permanently. What brings you to civilization? Caleb explained the situation, leaving out some of the more personal details. James listened carefully, his expression growing serious. This Richard Carver sounds dangerous, James said. $200 reward will bring every bounty hunter and desperado in the territory looking for you. Are you sure Cheyenne is safe? Safer than Deadwood, Caleb said, and we needed to get Eleanor's money. We will only stay a few days. Where will you go after? Caleb hesitated. Back to the Black Hills, I hope. Eleanor says she wants to come with me, but I am giving her time to reconsider. James studied him. You have fallen for her. Is it that obvious? To someone who knows you? Yes, I have never seen you look at anyone the way you just looked when you said her name. James clasped his shoulder. I hope it works out, friend. You deserve some happiness. They talked for a while longer, catching up on old times and mutual friends. When Caleb returned to the boarding house, he found Eleanor waiting for him with a small leather pouch, her inheritance, converted to cash and a few gold pieces. It is not a fortune, Eleanor said, but it is enough to start over, to buy a small piece of land or open a shop somewhere. Or to improve a mountain cabin and stock it for winter, Caleb suggested carefully. Eleanor smiled. Or that. That evening, they had dinner at a restaurant, a luxury after days of trail food. Eleanor wore one of the dresses Martha had packed for her, and with her hair properly styled, she looked like the refined lady she had been raised to be. Caleb felt underdressed in his cleanest shirt and vest, but Eleanor kept smiling at him across the table like he was the only person in the world. "Huh, what do you think?" Caleb asked as they walked back to the boarding house under the stars. "Could you really give all this up? Restaurants and boarding houses, other people, society?" "This is not what I'm giving up," Eleanor said. "What I'm giving up is the expectation that I have to fit into a certain mold, that I have to want what everyone says I should want. The truth is, I never liked society very much, the constant judgment, the endless rules about what was proper. I always felt like I was acting, playing a part. With you, I feel like myself." "Who is that?" Caleb asked. "Who are you, Eleanor Whitmore?" Eleanor thought for a moment. "I'm someone who loves learning and teaching. Someone who values kindness over wealth, authenticity over appearances. Someone who would rather watch a sunset from a mountain than attend 100 fancy balls. Someone who wants to build something real with her own hands, who wants to live honestly and fully." She looked up at him. "Someone who has fallen hopelessly in love with a mountain man." Caleb stopped walking and pulled her into his arms, kissing her right there on the street despite the scandalized looks from passers-by. "I love you too," he said against her lips. "I think I have loved you since you had the courage to stand up and leave that reception hall." They spent 3 more days in Cheyenne, during which Eleanor bought supplies for their return journey, and Caleb arranged to have some items shipped to Rapid City that they could collect later, including books for Eleanor, teaching materials in case she wanted to offer lessons to any children in the mining camps, and various other goods that would make the cabin more comfortable. On the 4th day, disaster struck. Caleb had gone to the general store to pick up their last few supplies when he heard shouting from the direction of the boarding house. His blood ran cold. He dropped the supplies and ran, pushing through the crowd that had gathered. Richard Carver stood in front of the boarding house, flanked by 2 rough-looking men with guns prominently displayed on their hips. Mrs. Patterson was blocking the door, arms crossed, refusing to let them enter. "I have legal right," Richard was shouting. "That woman is my wife, and this man kidnapped her. Stand aside or I will have you arrested for obstruction." "I will do no such thing," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "No one in my house is being dragged off by the likes of you." Caleb pushed to the front of the crowd. "Let Eleanor speak for herself," he called out. Richard whirled around, his face contorting with rage when he saw Caleb. You are under arrest for kidnapping and corruption of another man's wife." "I did not kidnap anyone," Caleb said calmly, though his hand moved to the knife at his belt. "Eleanor left of her own free will." "Liar!" Richard spat. He turned to the crowd. "This man forced my wife to leave our wedding reception, has held her captive for over a week, and now he dares to show his face in public? Where's the sheriff?" "Right here," a new voice said. A tall man with a silver star pinned to his vest pushed through the crowd. Sheriff Tom Daniels was a legend in Cheyenne, known for being fair-minded but firm. "What seems to be the problem?" Richard launched into his version of events, painting himself as the wronged husband and Eleanor as the helpless victim. Caleb listened with growing anger, but forced himself to stay calm. Getting into a fight would only make things worse. When Richard finished, Sheriff Daniels looked at Caleb. "Your side." "May I speak to Eleanor first?" Caleb asked. "She is the one who should tell her story." The sheriff nodded and gestured to Mrs. Patterson, who reluctantly stepped aside. Caleb climbed the stairs to their room, his heart pounding. Eleanor was standing at the window, her face pale but composed. "I heard," she said. "Richard found us." "You do not have to face him," Caleb said. "I can tell the sheriff what happened, and we can leave town right now." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "I am tired of running, tired of being afraid. Richard needs to hear that I left him by choice and that I am never coming back." Together, they walked downstairs. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the commotion. Sheriff Daniels stood in the middle, clearly wanting to get to the bottom of things before making any arrests. Eleanor stepped forward, and a murmur ran through the crowd. She looked directly at Richard, and Caleb saw her straighten her spine, gathering her courage. "I was not kidnapped," she said clearly, her voice carrying. "I left you, Richard, because you hit me, because you are cruel and controlling, because I would rather die than spend my life as your wife." Richard's face flushed red. "That is a lie. I never laid a hand on you except in love." "Then explain the black eye she had at your wedding," Caleb said coldly. "She fell," Richard insisted. "She has always been clumsy." "Let me see your hand," Sheriff Daniel said to Eleanor. Eleanor held out her left hand, showing her wedding ring finger. The gold band Richard had placed there was gone. "I left this on the table at the cabin where I have been staying. I am not your wife anymore, Richard. I do not care what the law says. I will never be your wife." "The law says otherwise," Richard snarled. He gestured to his hired men. "Take her, now." The two men moved forward, but Caleb stepped in front of Eleanor. "You want her? You go through me." "I'm warning you," Sheriff Daniel said, his hand moving to his gun. "No one is taking anyone anywhere until I sort this out." "That woman is my legal wife," Richard said. "The law is on my side." "Maybe so," Sheriff Daniels acknowledged. He looked at Eleanor. "Ma'am, did this man hit you?" "Yes," Eleanor said. 2 days before our wedding. He hit me hard enough to leave a bruise that was still visible on my wedding day. Multiple people saw it." "It is true," Mrs. Patterson spoke up. "When she arrived here, I could still see the fading bruise. And I saw how frightened she was when they arrived. That is the look of a woman who has been abused, Sheriff. I have seen it before." Several other women in the crowd nodded and murmured agreement. Sheriff Daniels looked thoughtful. "Here is how this is going to work," he said finally. "Mr. Carver, you may have a legal marriage, but I have seen enough bad marriages to know when a woman is running for good reason. I am not going to force Mrs. Carver to go with you today. However, I am also not going to arrest Mr. Montgomery without more evidence of kidnapping. I suggest you both get lawyers and sort this out properly." "That is unacceptable," Richard shouted. You demand nothing in my town," Sheriff Daniels said, his voice hardening. "Now, I suggest you leave before I find a reason to arrest you for disturbing the peace." Richard looked around at the crowd, at the unfriendly faces, at Eleanor standing defiant beside Caleb. For a moment, Caleb thought he might actually try to force the issue, but then Richard seemed to deflate. "This is not over," he said quietly, venomously. "I will ruin you both. I will make sure you never find peace anywhere in this territory." "Try it," Caleb said. "But Eleanor and I are leaving Cheyenne, and I do not think you want to follow me into the wilderness. Men have gotten lost in those mountains and never been found." It was a threat barely veiled, and everyone present knew it. Richard paled slightly, then turned and stalked away, his hired men following. The crowd began to disperse, though many people stopped to offer Eleanor words of support. Sheriff Daniels pulled Caleb aside. "I meant what I said about lawyers, but I will give you both some advice. Leave town. Today. Go somewhere remote and stay there. Eventually, Carver will realize it is not worth pursuing you. Men like him hate to be defied, but they hate looking foolish even more. If you disappear completely, he will eventually give up and save face by claiming you died or left the territory." "Thank you, Sheriff," Caleb said. "Thank your wife," Sheriff Daniels said. "She was very brave just now. Most women in her situation would not have stood up like that." Within 2 hours, Caleb and Eleanor had packed up, said their goodbyes to Mrs. Patterson, and were riding out of Cheyenne. They took a different route back, even more remote than the one they had used coming south, and they rode hard for the first day, putting as much distance between themselves and Richard as possible. That night, camped in a sheltered valley, Eleanor finally allowed herself to break down. She cried against Caleb's chest, releasing all the fear and tension she had been holding in. Caleb held her, murmuring reassurances, until she finally cried herself out. "I thought I was going to lose you," she said when she could speak again. "When I heard Richard's voice, I thought he was going to take me back or have you arrested." "Never," Caleb said fiercely. "I would never let him take you. We would have kept running until we found somewhere he could not reach us." "I do not want to run anymore," Eleanor said. "I want to go home. To your cabin, to our cabin. I want to start building a life." "Then that is what we will do," Caleb promised. The journey back to the Black Hills took 10 days, as they were extra cautious and took an even more circuitous route. But finally, on a warm afternoon in early July, they rode up to Caleb's cabin. Everything was just as they had left it, waiting peacefully in the mountain meadow. Eleanor slid down from Red and just stood there for a moment, looking at the cabin, the barn, the vegetable garden, the forest beyond. Then she turned to Caleb with tears in her eyes. "I am home," she said simply. Over the next weeks and months, they worked together to turn the cabin into a true home. Eleanor planted a larger garden and learned to preserve food for the winter. Caleb built an addition to the cabin, creating a small separate room that could serve as a schoolroom if Eleanor decided to offer lessons to any mining camp children. They hunted together, with Eleanor becoming a decent shot, and they fished in the streams and they spent long evenings talking by the fire. In September, Caleb rode down to the nearest mining camp and quietly spread the word that there was a teacher available for any children whose parents wanted them educated. 3 families took him up on the offer, and twice a week, their children rode up to the cabin for lessons. Eleanor was radiant when teaching, and Caleb loved watching her work with the children, seeing her patience and enthusiasm. Martha visited monthly, bringing news and supplies. She reported that Richard Carver had indeed eventually given up his pursuit. Some said he had left Deadwood entirely, though others claimed he stayed, but told everyone his wife had died in the wilderness. Either way, he made no further attempts to find Eleanor. As autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and red, Caleb asked Eleanor to marry him properly. Not a wedding in a church with guests and expectations, but a simple ceremony in front of Martha and Thomas and James Cooper, who traveled up from Cheyenne for the occasion. They spoke their vows beside the creek behind the cabin, with the mountains as witnesses, and Caleb placed a simple silver band on Eleanor's finger. "I love you," he said. "For the rest of my days, I will love you and protect you and build a life with you." "I love you," Eleanor replied. "You saved me, but more than that, you saw me, the real me, and you gave me the freedom to become who I was meant to be." That winter was hard, as Caleb had warned. The snow piled high, and there were weeks when they could not leave the cabin at all. But Eleanor did not complain. She read books by the fire, practiced her shooting, and helped Caleb with his traps when the weather allowed. They talked for hours, never running out of things to say, and they made love with a passion and tenderness that deepened with each passing day. In the spring, Eleanor realized she was pregnant. The baby came in late autumn of 1877, a healthy boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair. They named him Daniel, and Caleb felt his heart grow impossibly larger as he held his son for the first time. "I never thought I could be this happy," he told Eleanor as she nursed Daniel by the fire. "I thought I was meant to be alone." "You were never meant to be alone," Eleanor said, looking up at him with so much love it took his breath away. "You were just waiting for the right person to find you, or in this case, for you to rescue her from a terrible wedding." Caleb laughed and kissed her forehead. "Best decision I ever made, turning that horse around and going back. Best decision I ever made, saying yes when you offered me a way out," Eleanor countered. Daniel grew strong and healthy, and Eleanor continued teaching the mining camp children. A few years later, she gave birth to twin girls, Emma and Rose, who inherited their mother's auburn hair and quick minds. The cabin grew even more crowded, so Caleb built a second story, making more room for their growing family. The years passed peacefully. They had challenges, certainly, harsh winters, difficult births, the occasional conflict with wild animals or difficult neighbors. But they faced everything together, their love growing stronger and deeper with each passing season. Eleanor became known throughout the Black Hills as an excellent teacher, and the small schoolroom in their cabin eventually grew into a proper one-room schoolhouse that Caleb built in the nearest mining camp. Eleanor would ride down twice a week to teach, always returning home to her family in the evenings. Caleb continued to hunt and trap, but he also began taking on work as a guide for newcomers to the territory, much like his friend James. He had a reputation for being fair and honest, and people sought him out for advice about surviving in the mountains. Martha remained a constant presence in their lives, delighting in her nieces and nephew. She often remarked that she had never seen two people more perfectly suited to each other than Caleb and Eleanor. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Caleb took Eleanor back to the spot where he had first kissed her, beside the river on their journey to Cheyenne. They stood there in the twilight, watching the stars come out, and Caleb pulled his wife close. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Giving up the life you could have had in a city, becoming a proper teacher with a proper school, all of that?" Eleanor looked up at him, and even after 10 years of marriage and 3 children, Caleb still felt his heart skip when she smiled at him. "Not for a single moment," she said. "You gave me something I never thought I could have, freedom. The freedom to choose my own path, to become my own person, to build a life based on what I wanted rather than what others expected. And you gave me love, real love, the kind that empowers rather than controls. How could I ever regret that? I love you, Caleb said, kissing her softly, more now than the day we married, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. That is a mathematical impossibility, Eleanor teased. Eventually you will reach the maximum capacity for love. Then I will expand my capacity, Caleb said, grinning. I am very determined. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the river and feeling grateful for the chain of choices that had led them to this moment. A bride with a black eye, a mountain man who could not walk away. A single moment of courage that changed everything. As they rode back to their cabin that night where their children waited with Martha babysitting, Eleanor thought about the girl she had been. Frightened, controlled, trapped in a life she did not want. That girl was gone now, replaced by a woman who knew her own strength, who had built a life with her own hands, who loved fiercely and was fiercely loved in return. And Caleb, riding beside his wife under the stars, thought about the lonely man he had been, convinced he was meant for solitude. He had been wrong. He had just been waiting, though he had not known it, for someone brave enough to take a chance on a different kind of life. Years continued to pass in their mountain home. Daniel grew into a strong young man who combined his father's practical skills with his mother's sharp intellect. The twins, Emma and Rose, were inseparable, both inheriting their mother's love of teaching and their father's love of the wilderness. When Caleb turned 45, he and Eleanor added another room to the cabin, this one specifically designed as a library. Over the years, Eleanor had accumulated hundreds of books, many sent by former students who had gone on to successful lives and never forgot the teacher who had first inspired them. The library became a gathering place, not just for their family, but for the entire community. People would ride up from the camps to borrow books, and Eleanor would hold reading groups and discussions on Sunday afternoons. The schoolhouse in the mining camp thrived, eventually getting a second teacher to help Eleanor as more families settled in the area. Eleanor trained several young women as teachers, passing on her skills and her passion for education. She felt deeply satisfied, knowing that she was making a real difference in the lives of children who might otherwise have grown up illiterate. On a crisp October day in 1890, 14 years after Eleanor had first arrived at Caleb's cabin, the family gathered for a special occasion. Daniel, now 13, had shot his first elk, and according to tradition, Caleb was teaching him how to properly dress and preserve the meat. Eleanor watched from the porch, Emma and Rose beside her, all of them smiling at the sight of father and son working together. "I hope I marry someone like Papa someday," Emma said thoughtfully. She was 10 now, with her mother's intelligent eyes and her father's determination. "Me too," Rose agreed. "Someone kind and strong and who treats me like an equal." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. This was what she had fought for, what she and Caleb had built together, a family where love was based on respect and partnership, where strength meant protecting rather than controlling, where their daughters would grow up expecting to be treated with dignity and kindness. "You will," Eleanor said firmly, "because you both know what real love looks like, and you will never settle for less." That evening, after Daniel's elk was properly stored and celebrated, the family gathered around the fire as they did every night. Caleb sat in his chair with Eleanor curled up beside him, while the children sprawled on the fur rugs, reading or working on their studies. "Tell us the story," Rose said suddenly, "about how you and Mama met." It was a familiar request. The children never tired of hearing about their mother's dramatic escape and their father's heroic rescue. Caleb looked at Eleanor, and she nodded with a smile. He began the tale, describing the wedding in Deadwood, the bride with a black eye, his decision to turn around and go back. The children listened raptly, even though they had heard it dozens of times before. When he reached the part about Eleanor choosing to leave with him, Rose sighed dramatically. "That's the most romantic thing ever." "It was not romantic at the time," Eleanor said with a laugh. "It was terrifying. I had no idea if I could trust your father, if I was making the right choice, if Richard would catch us. But sometimes you have to take a leap of faith." "And sometimes," Caleb added, squeezing Eleanor's hand, "faith is rewarded beyond your wildest dreams." Later that night, After the children were asleep in their rooms, Caleb and Eleanor stood on the porch looking up at the stars. The air was cold, promising an early snow, and they stood close together for warmth. "Do you ever think about where you would be if I had not turned that horse around?" Caleb asked quietly. Eleanor was silent for a moment. "Sometimes," she admitted. "In my darker moments, I think about what my life would have become. Richard would have broken me eventually, one way or another. I probably would not have survived 10 years with him." "Do not think about that," Caleb said, pulling her closer. "That is not what happened." "No," Eleanor agreed. "What happened is that a brave, kind, ridiculously stubborn mountain man decided that a stranger's welfare mattered more than his own safety or convenience. You risked everything for me, Caleb. You barely knew me, but you risked everything." "I could not walk away," Caleb said simply. "It was not in me to leave you there." "I know," Eleanor said. "That is who you are. That is why I fell in love with you so quickly. You saw me as a person worth saving, worth protecting, worth risking things for. Richard saw me as property, but you always saw me as human." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind in the pines and the distant call of an owl. After all these years, Caleb still marveled at how lucky he was. He had been content with his solitary life, but he had not truly been happy. Eleanor had brought joy and laughter and love into his world, and their children had multiplied that joy 1,000 times over. "We should go inside," Eleanor said eventually. "It is getting cold," but neither of them moved immediately. These quiet moments together, after the children were asleep and the day's work was done, were precious. They had learned over the years that marriage required these moments of connection, these times when they focused solely on each other. "I love you," Caleb said, not for the first time that day and certainly not for the last. He tried to say it at least once every day, wanting Eleanor to never doubt how he felt. "I love you too," Eleanor replied, kissing him softly. "Thank you for turning that horse around. Thank you for coming back for me." "Always," Caleb said. "In every life, in every circumstance, I would always come back for you." The years continued their steady march forward. The children grew and eventually began lives of their own, though none of them strayed far from the mountains they had been born in. Daniel became a skilled guide and hunter like his father, eventually marrying a sweet-tempered girl named Sarah from one of the mining camps. Emma trained as a teacher under her mother's guidance and took over the schoolhouse completely when Eleanor finally decided to retire. Rose surprised everyone by becoming fascinated with medicine, studying under the camp doctor, and eventually becoming a midwife and healer respected throughout the territory. Caleb and Eleanor became grandparents, then great-grandparents. Their cabin remained the heart of their growing family, with children and grandchildren constantly visiting, bringing noise and laughter and joy. In the summer of 1901, 25 years after Eleanor had first arrived at the cabin, the family held a massive celebration for Caleb and Eleanor's anniversary. 3 generations gathered, children, grandchildren, even a few great-grandchildren. They roasted a whole elk, and there was music and dancing and endless stories. Martha was there too, now in her 70s, but still sharp and lively. She pulled Eleanor aside at one point during the celebration. "I need to tell you something," Martha said. "That day when you married Richard, I felt so helpless. I knew what he was going to do to you, but I did not know how to stop it. I was so grateful when Caleb went back for you. It was the bravest thing I have ever seen." "It changed my life," Eleanor said simply. "It gave me a life. I cannot imagine where I would be if Caleb had not come back for me." "You would have found a way," Martha said confidently. "You are one of the strongest women I know, Eleanor. You would have survived somehow." "Maybe," Eleanor acknowledged, "but surviving is not the same as living. Caleb gave me the chance to truly live, to build the life I wanted, rather than endure the one forced upon me." As the sun began to set on that perfect summer day, Caleb found Eleanor standing at the edge of the meadow, watching their family gathered around the cabin. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against his solid, still strong frame. 25 years, he said wonderingly. "It feels like both forever and no time at all." "I know what you mean," Eleanor said. "I can barely remember the frightened girl I was before you came into my life. She feels like a different person entirely." "She was a different person," Caleb said. She became you, strong, confident, capable, loved. That is what freedom did for you. That is what you did for me, Eleanor corrected. Freedom was the opportunity, but you were the catalyst. They stood together as the stars began to appear, watching their family, counting their blessings. 3 children, all grown and happy. 7 grandchildren so far, with more likely on the way. A life built on love and respect and partnership, a legacy that would extend far beyond their own years. If I could go back, Caleb said quietly, back to that moment when I was riding away from Deadwood after your wedding, knowing everything that would happen, the danger, the conflict with Richard, the hard winters, all of it, I would still turn that horse around, every single time. And I would still say yes, Eleanor said, every single time. As they walked back toward the cabin hand in hand, Eleanor reflected on the strange, wonderful path her life had taken. She had started as a bride with a black eye, trapped in a nightmare marriage, with no hope for the future. And then a mountain man with kind eyes and a protective heart had offered her a choice, and she had been brave enough to take it. That single choice had led to everything. A true marriage built on love and respect, children who grew up knowing they were cherished, a career teaching that had touched hundreds of lives, a home in the mountains that had become a refuge, not just for her family, but for the entire community. She thought about the women she had taught over the years, young girls who had come to her school not knowing how to read, who had blossomed under her guidance. She thought about the mothers she had counseled when they faced difficulties in their marriages, encouraging them to stand up for themselves, to demand better treatment. She thought about her own daughters and granddaughters growing up strong and confident, knowing their worth. All of this had started because one man had looked at a stranger with a black eye and decided he could not walk away. Because one woman had been brave enough to risk everything for the chance at freedom. That night, lying in bed with Caleb's arms around her and the sounds of their family settling down for the night throughout the cabin, Eleanor felt a profound sense of contentment. Her life had not been perfect, no life was, but it had been hers. She had chosen it, built it with her own hands alongside the man she loved. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb murmured sleepily. "How grateful I am," Eleanor whispered back, "for all of this, for you, for the life we built together." "Me too," Caleb said, kissing her temple. "Every single day I'm grateful." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had built. Outside, the mountains stood eternal under the stars, keeping watch over the cabin where a bride with a black eye had found freedom, love, and a home. And high above, if mountains could smile, these mountains would have smiled at the happy ending they had witnessed, at the mountain man who had turned around, at the bride who had been brave enough to take a chance, and at the beautiful life they had built together in the wild, free spaces of the American West. The next morning, as their family prepared to depart back to their various homes, Eleanor stood on the porch watching them go. Her heart was full. Daniel kissed her cheek and promised to visit again soon. Emma reminded her that she had committed to helping at the school next month for a special program. Rose asked for advice on a difficult birthing case she was handling. When the last of them had disappeared down the trail, Eleanor turned to find Caleb watching her with that same look he had given her 25 years ago, protective, loving, with just a hint of wonder, as if he still could not quite believe she had chosen him. "What should we do with the rest of our day?" he asked. Eleanor smiled and took his hand. "Let us go for a walk, like we used to do when we were young." "We are still young," Caleb protested, though at 53 he was starting to feel his age in his joints during the cold mornings. "Then let us go prove it," Eleanor challenged. They walked through the forest together, following trails they had walked 1,000 times before. They did not talk much, comfortable in the silence that came from decades of companionship. Sometimes Caleb would point out an animal track or an interesting plant. Sometimes Eleanor would quote a line from one of her books that the scenery had reminded her of. They ended up at the spot where Caleb had first kissed Eleanor all those years ago during their journey to Cheyenne. The river still flowed strong and clear, and the grass along the banks was soft and green. "Do you remember?" Caleb asked, pulling her down to sit beside him. "Of course I remember," Eleanor said. "I remember thinking that I had never been kissed like that before, like I was precious and cherished rather than possessed. I remember thinking that if I could feel like that every day for the rest of my life, I would be the luckiest woman alive." "And do you?" Caleb asked. "Feel like that?" "Every single day," Eleanor confirmed. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You kept your promise, Caleb. You gave me freedom, love, and a life worth living. What more could anyone ask for?" "Nothing," Caleb said, wrapping his arm around her. "Absolutely nothing." They sat there for a long time, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built something beautiful together, who had proven that love based on respect and freedom was the strongest foundation of all. As the sun climbed higher in the sky and the day grew warm, they eventually stood and began the walk back to their cabin, their home, the place where Eleanor had first tasted true freedom, where their children had been born, where they had built a life that far exceeded anything either of them had imagined possible. And if you asked either of them if they had any regrets, they would have said no. Caleb did not regret turning that horse around and going back. Eleanor did not regret saying yes and taking a chance on an unknown future with a mountain man she barely knew. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is offer help to a stranger. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is accept that help and trust that the future, however uncertain, has to be better than the present. They had both been brave on that June day in 1876, and that bravery had been rewarded with 25 years of happiness and love, with a family that honored their legacy, and with a partnership that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger each time. As they reached their cabin and Caleb held the door open for Eleanor, she paused and looked up at him one more time. Thank you," she said softly, "for everything, for seeing me, for saving me, for loving me." "Thank you," Caleb replied just as softly, "for trusting me, for building this life with me, for loving me back." They went inside together, and the door closed behind them. But their story continued. It continued in their children and grandchildren. It continued in the students Eleanor had taught, who went on to teach their own children the value of education. It continued in the example they set, of a marriage built on mutual respect, of love that empowered rather than controlled, of two people who had chosen each other freely and built something beautiful together. In the Wild West of the 1870s, where life was hard and justice was often rough, where women had few choices and men often abused their power, Caleb and Eleanor had created something different. They had proven that it was possible to build a relationship based on equality and respect, that love did not have to mean ownership, that freedom and partnership could coexist. And it had all started with a simple decision: a mountain man seeing a bride with a black eye and choosing to turn around and go back for her, and a frightened woman finding the courage to say yes when offered a way out. Two brave choices. One perfect ending. As the years rolled on toward the turn of the century and beyond, the story of Caleb and Eleanor became something of a legend in the Black Hills. Old-timers would tell the tale to youngsters about the mountain man who rescued a bride from her own wedding, about the couple who built a life in the wilderness, about love that conquered fear and freedom that healed wounds. And every telling ended the same way. She was the bride who showed up with a black eye. The mountain man turned around and went back for him, for the man who had hurt her. No, wait, that's not right. He turned around and went back for her, and she was brave enough to go with him. And they lived happily ever after, the way all good people deserve to. The end.